This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Valerie Sanderson, and in the early hours of Wednesday the 16th of May, these are our main stories. North Korea raises doubts over Kim Jong-un's summit meeting with Donald Trump. At the UN, the US defends Israeli troops who opened fire during protests on the country's border with Gaza. For the first time, Facebook reveals how much violent content, hate speech and terror propaganda it deletes.
3.4 million pieces of graphic violence, 837 million pieces of spam. They removed 21 million posts that contained adult nudity or sexual activity.
Also in this podcast, reaction on the high street after a British fashion chain is forced to reconsider charging more for clothing for larger women.
We know when we shame people for their size that actually they tend to hide at home, eat more, and get bigger.
And why two German footballers are in trouble for giving their shirts to Turkey's President Erdogan. But first, is North Korea about to cancel an unprecedented summit between Kim Jong-un and President Trump? Pyongyang has called off upcoming talks with Seoul, describing joint combat exercises between America and South Korea as an intentional military provocation. It also said Washington should undertake careful deliberation. The response from the US has been cautious. Its State Department spokeswoman is Heather Newart.
They're exercises that are legal. They're planned well in advance. We have not heard anything from that government or the government of South Korea to indicate that we would not continue conducting these exercises or that we would not continue planning for our meeting between President Trump and Kim Jong-un next month.
Well, recently North Korea had indicated it was okay with the joint exercises. So what's going on? Nick Miles has been finding out from our State Department correspondent, Barbara Pletasher.
Well, it's not clear what's changed. The message from North Korea was that Kim Jong-un had said, okay, yes, we understand that these exercises are important for you. They're a utility for you. They help you to, work together with your military training, and we will not contest them this time. And they do happen every year. So the return of this regular, what used to be this regular sort of classic bellicose rhetoric is a bit of a surprise because of the charm offensive that Kim Jong-un has been throwing on and because of the meetings that have been happening both with the South Koreans and with the Americans. So I think it's not entirely unexpected that there wouldn't be hiccups of this nature before the summit, but perhaps not this far down the road towards it. Analysts are saying that in terms of threats, it's actually quite a mild one. Mr. Kim Jong-un is not saying the summit won't happen. It's more like he's saying, oh, it would be a shame if it didn't happen. And they're suggesting that perhaps all of this is really directed more at South Korea as a warning to remind them who they're dealing with and not to get too comfortable or too cozy with the U.S. agenda.
Having said that, it is likely to be of concern to Washington, isn't it? Particularly given that Donald Trump has set an awful lot of store in this being a huge diplomatic coup for him.
Well, it won't be welcome, that's for sure. Donald Trump has set a lot of diplomatic capital on this summit. He's personally, I think, quite keen to go. He talks about it a lot. He sounds excited when he's talking about it, and he sounds as if he thinks he could make a difference to the issue of North Korea's nuclear program by meeting directly with Kim Jong-un. On top of that, of course, you've actually had some input by high-level officials. So the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, has made 2 trips to North Korea and spoken directly with Kim Jong-un for quite lengthy periods in which he said they had very serious talks about North Korea's strategy, what it meant, what it would mean for North Korea to dismantle its nuclear weapons, how far it was willing to go, all of which sounded like Kim Jong-un is quite serious about this step. So this would not be a welcome development, but as I said, so far, at least publicly, the State Department is not treating it as an existential threat to the summit.
Barbara Pletasher talking to the newsroom's Nick Miles. In Gaza, families have been burying their dead after almost 60 Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces on Monday. We'll be hearing shortly from Gaza, where Tuesday appears to have been a far less violent day. But first to the United Nations, where Israel has been heavily criticised by many members for the levels of lethal force it used. Before the Security Council meeting, the UN Human Rights Office condemned what it called the appalling deadly violence by Israeli forces and suggested that Israel appeared to have broken international law. Its spokesman, Rupert Colville, said it was nonsense to suggest that the Palestinians had posed a danger to Israeli forces.
Under international law, live fire should only be used as an absolute last resort in a situation where there's an imminent threat to life or serious injury of those using the live fire. And clearly that has not been the case with this very, very large number of casualties.
But addressing the UN Security Council, the United States Ambassador Nikki Haley said Israel's response had been restrained.
I asked my colleagues here in the Security Council, who among us would accept this type of activity on your border? No one would. No country in this chamber would act with more restraint than Israel has. In fact, the records of several countries here today suggest they would be much less restrained.
For more on that debate, I spoke to Neda Tawfik, our correspondent who was at UNHQ in New York.
You know, Nikki Haley has long argued that the council is biased. And so even with the death toll that we've seen in Gaza, she began right away criticizing that this meeting was taking place.
And what about the rest of the Security Council?
Well, pretty much all of the members, apart from the United States, were on the same page in saying that they were shocked and appalled by the high number of Palestinians killed, and in particular, Israel's use of live fire. They agreed with the UN Secretary General that there should be an independent international investigation into the events. The U.S.'s ally, Britain's ambassador to the UN, actually, Karen Pierce, went as far as to say that that investigation should include to what extent Israeli forces' rules of engagements were in line with international law. And I should say that the entire council actually wanted to adopt a statement in favor of an investigation, but the United States blocked it. And so after the council session, the European members on the council, they all stood together and they said that they want that while they, recognized Israel's right to protect its borders, that they should only use lethal force as a last resort, that Palestinians had a right to peaceful protest, while at the same time Hamas had a responsibility, along with those leading the protests, to make sure that they were nonviolent.
So, what happened in Gaza itself on Tuesday? Our Middle East editor Jeremy Bowen reports.
It was much quieter along the border wire where so many Palestinians died. No big protests, though a 51-year-old Palestinian man, Nasser Harab, was killed, shot through the chest. By late afternoon, at one of the 8 locations where protests happened, hundreds of people had gathered. Families were there with young children eating ice lollies. Young men went closer to the wire, burning tires and loosing off a few stones from catapults. The Israelis sent over a drone that fired tear gas canisters. Families turned to go home. The young men brought up more tires. Looking at what was happening, it seemed that many people were hoping for some kind of turning point. But the fundamentals of this conflict don't change. Throughout the day, I've been asking Palestinians if Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement that runs Gaza, had forced them to demonstrate. Everyone I spoke to said it was their decision. On the Israeli side, a spokesman for the Israeli military, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, insisted that Hamas had cynically exploited Palestinian civilians.
What we've seen are unprecedented levels of violence in riots, and we haven't seen many demonstrators, for sure not on our fence. We are not here looking to create casualties of Palestinians. That is not our aim. We are simply here to defend what is ours. We are defending our sovereignty, our civilians that live in close proximity.
He said one Israeli soldier was wounded. Without doubt, Hamas activists organized the protests, but there was a huge turnout of civilians who are fed up with life under a blockade imposed by Israel and Egypt. I'm in a small and shabby flat in Gaza, full of mourning women, small children, and at the heart of it is a young mother, Mariam Al-Gandour, and the body of her 8-month-old daughter, Layla. Layla was caught up in the tear gas that was fired into Gaza from Israel in the course of the disturbances and the killings that went on yesterday, and she died. Mariam cuddled her dead baby and kissed her face. She was in a fog of despair. Until there is political progress and there are no visible signs of hope, people will continue to suffer and die.
Jeremy Bowen reporting. A World Trade Organization panel has ruled that the European Union has failed to withdraw illegal subsidies granted to the aerospace giant Airbus. The decision could open the way for billions of dollars worth of punitive tariffs being imposed on imports of European goods. Here's Theo Leggett.
For the past 14 years, the United States and the European Union have been grappling with one another within the World Trade Organization. At issue are the huge sums provided by European governments over the course of 4 decades to help Airbus develop a series of large passenger jets. In 2011, the WTO concluded that Airbus had indeed received illegal funding. The United States subsequently claimed that despite that decision, European governments had continued to provide unfair support to Airbus. In its latest ruling, the WTO confirmed that this was indeed the case. The US trade representative warned that unless the EU took action to stop harming US interests, it would have to retaliate with sanctions on EU products.
Theo Leggett reporting. They were born in Germany of Turkish parents. They both play football for the German national team. But Mesut Ozil and İlkay Gündoğan have faced a storm of criticism for having their photographs taken presenting signed football shirts to Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Gündoğan signed his with the words, "For my honoured president, with great respect." The timing is significant because there are presidential and parliamentary elections in Turkey next month. Seda Seza Bilen, a journalist working for the Deutsche Welle Turkish service in Bonn, explained the story to the BBC's Nuala McGovern.
In the German press, it's been widely discussed, and they couldn't make their decision whether that was pure stupidity or they lack political judgment. These guys were seen as examples of successful integration in Germany, and that's why people are so upset here, especially the politicians from all the fractions and parties. Everybody is very upset because they are examples as successful integration examples. And now German press also says that they didn't do any good for Germany because they are now, used as campaign material for President Erdogan, which Germany sees as violating democratic rights.
And has Özil or Gündoğan actually spoken out about what their motivation was?
Following the backlash, Gündoğan released a statement and he said that they didn't really intend to make a political statement with their photos, and he expressed that they are committed to the values of the German Football Federation, but the damage was done already.
And there is and has been, we've seen with previous Turkish elections, this tension between Germany and Turkey. There was previously politicians wanted to come to Germany to campaign, really, and Germany didn't want that to happen, and it caused so much debate as well.
Yes, Germany banned Turkish politicians to campaign on the German soil following tension between the two countries after the failed coup attempt in July 2016. And since then, diplomatic relations have been really strained between the two countries. That's why from politicians to German Football Association, there has been a huge reaction to those photos here.
Seda Seza Bilen. If you're looking for a big idea, try our new podcast that's exploring discoveries that are shaping our lives. So far this week, we've looked at what can monkeys tell us about the stock market? Can our experiences be passed down biologically to our children? And what data could tell us about the success of cities? So search for The Big Idea from the BBC World Service wherever you find your podcasts. Still to come in this podcast, we look back on the life of American author Tom Wolfe, who's died at the age of 88. For the first time, Facebook has revealed how much violent content, hate speech and terror propaganda it deletes. The social media site has published a breakdown of the inappropriate content it removes and the profiles it blocks. And as our technology reporter Dave Lee in San Francisco told me, the figures are huge.
Astronomical and perhaps only a small slice of the total problem. One of the striking things about Facebook's report, which is the first time they've put it out in public, is that for a long time they weren't even counting this problem. So these figures are from only the last 3 months of last year and the first 3 months of this year, because that's all the data they have on this issue. But in terms of how much they're dealing with, in just the first 3 months of this year, Facebook took down 3.4 million pieces of graphic violence from the service. They removed 21 million posts that contained adult nudity or sexual activity, 837 million pieces of spam. Much of this was done using automated systems, but where those systems didn't quite do very as well in was with hate speech. 2.5 million posts removed in the first 3 months of this year. That's up quite considerably from the end of last year. But crucially, only 38% of that hate speech was found by Facebook systems. The rest relied on humans, users, spotting hate speech and reporting it to Facebook. The big takeaway, I think, from this report is that there's still a long way to go before Facebook can say that it's really getting on top of this problem, particularly when it comes to spotting and removing this kind of stuff automatically without relying on human intervention of some kind.
And Facebook is notoriously secretive, isn't it? I mean, how much of this is damage limitation, do you think, after the Cambridge Analytica scandal?
This report doesn't really deal with that precise problem. I mean, Cambridge Analytica was very much about the misuse of data that had been harvested from Facebook. This report quite pointedly deals with simply bad things that have been posted to it. But I do think it's all part of the same mix. It's pressure on Facebook to come clean about what are some of the less appropriate uses of its network. So in this case, with this report, they're talking about inappropriate material. When it comes to Cambridge Analytica, that's inappropriate handling of data once it leaves the Facebook system. I think the company's under a lot of pressure on the abuse issue to be much more transparent about what is really going on the network. Although, like I say, like many things, Facebook is admitting that it hasn't been as aware of the issue as it could be, and therefore it's only really now just getting a handle on how big this problem might be.
Dave Lee. The Irish Taoiseach, or Prime Minister Leo Varadkar, has criticised anti-abortion campaigners for using posters showing children with Down syndrome. Ireland is holding a referendum in 10 days' time to decide whether to repeal the country's near-total ban on abortion. If voters choose to repeal the 8th Amendment, the Irish government plans to allow abortions essentially without restrictions until a woman is 12 weeks pregnant. Our Ireland correspondent Chris Page reports.
The campaign is highly charged, with those in favour of the status quo accusing the other side of understating how available terminations will be. But supporters of change are criticising their opponents for scaremongering. Canvassing in Dublin, the Taoiseach said it was wrong to use posters featuring children with Down syndrome because disability wouldn't be a lawful reason to end a pregnancy. The Love Both group, which wants to keep the 8th Amendment, said there was a global trend towards abortion on the grounds of Down syndrome, and it would be presumptuous to think Ireland would be different. The choice of imagery in campaign posters has been controversial. Photos of unborn children in the womb are common sights. Some showing aborted fetuses have also appeared. Organisations which work with women who've had abortions have said the pictures are deeply distressing, but campaigners who want to retain the current law argue that abortion shouldn't be sanitised.
Chris Page. With less than a month to go before the Football World Cup kicks off in Russia, the country is busy hosting another World Championship involving fewer ball skills and a great deal more brawn. The opening ceremony of the World Military Wrestling Championship took place in Moscow on Tuesday and featured some unusual displays of might. One strongman inflicted a crushing defeat on a frying pan. Our Moscow correspondent Steve Rosenberg went along to see it.
Now, if I say Russian entertainment, what comes to mind? The Bolshoi Ballet? A Russian folk choir? A touch of the old Shostakoviches, perhaps? Well, what's happening on this stage in front of me is a little different. A rather muscly man is bending a frying pan with his bare hands. It's just a mush of twisted metal now. He won't be frying any omelettes and that again, I can tell you. And just before that, another strong man was blowing up a rubber hot water bottle like a balloon until it burst. These are members of the Russian Bears, a so-called extreme strength group, fiercely patriotic, and well, just fierce, basically. They're the warm-up act for the World Championship that Russia is hosting. No, not soccer. There are no balls here, just biceps. It's the World Military Wrestling Championship. The world's top army wrestling teams are taking part. North Korea, Syria, Iran, China, Mongolia, but Germany and France too. Mind you, judging by the applause in the hall, the stars of this opening ceremony are the Russian Bears. Which is quite appropriate, really, in a country which increasingly is flexing its muscles on the international stage.
Steve Rosenberg. A British high street fashion chain has announced it will be reviewing its prices after an eagle-eyed shopper noticed it was charging more for its clothing range for larger women compared to smaller sizes. A customer told New Look the practice was unfair. The newsroom's Charlotte Gallagher told me more.
People are calling it a fat tax, say they're being penalised for being a bigger size. Now, the woman who kind of brought it to everyone's attention, she says she feels discriminated against for just being, I think she's a size 18, so just being slightly bigger than the average size now in the UK. But some people are actually saying, you know, it's fair enough. There's more material that goes into these bigger clothes, so people should have to pay more money. And the National Obesity Forum here in the UK, they think it's a good idea. They're saying that it could actually incentivise women to lose weight. I'm not sure that's going to work or how popular that idea will be. But Harriet Minter is a journalist specialising in women's rights, and she isn't buying that idea at all.
If you're looking at the difference between a size 0 and a size 24, yes, that's a big difference. But so is the difference between a size 0 and a size 12 or 14. I actually think pushing to say that we should force women to pay more because of their sizing for their clothing not only is a fat tax, we know when we shame people for their size that actually they tend to hide at home, eat more, and get bigger.
Now, Charlotte, what are New Look saying? I know you wear New Look because you're wearing New Look boots, aren't you?
Yeah, I've got my bargain New Look boots that I got in the sale on today. So they have responded. They're saying they're in the process of reviewing the prices of the plus size collection in a way which works best for its customers and business. Interestingly, Val, they're not saying they're going to lower the prices, though. They've not said they're going to keep the prices as they are. So they aren't making a statement as to what they're actually going to do further than having this review of their prices.
And is this an issue in the rest of the world too?
It is. Now, I don't know if you've heard of Old Navy, a big, huge chain store in the US owned by Gap. Now, they've had a very similar issue to this. And in 2014, a woman actually started a petition, got more than 20,000 signatures because she found out that women's plus size clothing they were being charged more for than women's smaller sizes, but men's clothing, it didn't matter what size, what waistband was, the men were still paying exactly the same price. Now, Old Navy said that was because there was more detail going into plus size garments in the fabrics and the designs and the details, but people are still unhappy. And actually, I went on the Old Navy website a few minutes ago, and that still seems to be the case. One pair of jeans for a plus size collection, you can be spending a lot more money on them than something from a smaller size.
If you're a woman.
If you're a woman. But yes, if you're a man, it doesn't matter what waist size you are, you'll still pay the same flat price. And we know, Val, that the plus size fashion industry is booming across the world. People are getting bigger. That's a fact. People still have money to spend on clothes. So is it a good idea for shops like New Look, Old Navy to be alienating thousands, even millions of potential customers who would spend their dollars there?
The newsroom's Charlotte Gallagher. Tom Wolfe, who wrote the novel Bonfire of the Vanities, which many say summed up 1980s America, has died at the age of 88. Vincent Dowd looks back at his career.
On October 14th, 1947, Captain Charles Yeager shattered the sound barrier. And the search began for a new breed of men.
In 1983, with the film of his book The Right Stuff about the early space race, Tom Wolfe proved he could engage America with real-life events. He'd been born in Richmond, Virginia. He later loved to play the Southern dandy in white suit and Homburg hat. By 1959, Tom Wolfe was on the Washington Post. Editors had spotted a witty writer with social insight. Moving to New York, Wolfe became the star of so-called new journalism. His subjects were pop culture, politics, and anything that belonged to the post-war baby boomers. Basically a conservative, he invented the ironic phrase radical chic after seeing composer Leonard Bernstein play host to the black rights group the Black Panthers.
I saw this man living in a 19-room duplex apartment in Park Avenue and 79th Street, raising his fist and saying, "Right on," as the field marshal of the Black Panthers announced the 10-point revolutionary program under which there would be no more privately owned duplexes. I could not resist. I tried to bring the scene alive, let the people talk, and steer the mind of the reader, rather than pulling back and passing moral judgment.
In 1980, he told the BBC he sensed an earlier ambition returning, to be a novelist.
I want to write a novel about New York, the city I've lived in for almost 20 years now. People will look back to this period in New York as a period whose Baroque excesses you can't help but wonder at. Now, I hope my performance in writing such a book will transcend any particular personal passions.
In 1987, the result was The Bonfire of the Vanities. The book was top of the New York Times bestseller list for weeks, a real achievement for a complex social satire. The film, with Tom Hanks, failed to capture the wry tone and flopped.
And there's the ramp back to Manhattan, see?
Sherman, what's that?
Calm down, Maria, it's just a big tire!
What are you doing?
I can't drive around it, can I?
Well, Sherman, be careful of your shoes.
The novel looked at the haves of Wall Street and the media and politics, and at the have-nots. Tom Wolfe didn't much like any of them. None of his later fiction matched the success of The Bonfire of the Vanities. But in that novel, Tom Wolfe had written a huge popular hit, which people will turn to decades from now to learn about the very particular America of the 1980s.
Vincent Dowd reporting. And that's it from us for now, but there'll be an updated version of the Global News podcast later. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Valerie Sanderson. Until next time, goodbye.